She told me. I knew she was right. It was just that Nephi was so innocent. I didn't want her to get hurt. I exhaled, nodded, and Rena smiled silently back at me. Over the next few weeks, we saw a little less of Nephi than normal. Rena told me that Nephi was making friends with a group of students from Taft. Rena said she had met them, and they all seemed normal, just regular nice people. Is she dating anyone in particular in that group? I asked. My protective instincts kicked in. Not really, or at least not yet. She told me. There is a boy. Well, actually, he's in his mid-20s working himself through school that Nephi seems to like. A few weeks later, Rena told me that Nephi was going out to dinner with the guy from her group, the older boy. He's picking her up here Friday night. She said, "You'll get to meet him." Imagine my surprise and concern when I recognized her date. It was Dennis Libby, the bartender from Papaya. I immediately became concerned. We had not heard a peep out of Jasmine or her brother since the encounter at the tennis courts. I sort of thought they were out of our lives for good. And now someone associated with the Papaya crowd was taking out young Nephi. "Nice to see you, Owen." Dennis smiled and shook my hand. I knew I had to have a discussion with him before they left. I also knew that Rena might think I was being overprotective if I started grilling him. I didn't want to embarrass Nephi. Still, I did need to have a private talk with Dennis. Fortunately, Nephi was not quite ready, and that gave me an opportunity. "Dennis," I said good-naturedly, "let me show you our garden out back." We walked to the backyard, and as we approached the garden, I turned to speak with Dennis. "I'm a little concerned," I told him, "about your friendship with Nephi." He stopped, puzzled. "Why?" he asked. I told him that anyone associated with Claude and Jasmine I had reason to be concerned about. My marriage to Jasmine did not end well. I told him. "Yeah, I heard a little about that," he said, "but I rarely see them anymore. I mostly work at the coffee shop, not in the bar. And Claude and his sister are almost never in the coffee shop," he explained. I nodded, thinking about what he had told me. I felt a little better knowing he did not have regular contact with the brother and sister. "Okay," I said, "just be careful with Nephi. She is very special to her sister and I." I added. Dennis nodded. "I will, Owen. I really like her," he added. After they left, I thought about Dennis. There was nothing wrong with him other than the fact that he worked with Claude and Jasmine. He was a tall, nice-looking young man, and I admired his resolve to work himself through college. He had always been courteous and pleasant. I guess I really shouldn't lump him in with Claude and Jasmine. The more I thought about it, the better I felt about the situation. Nephi and Dennis seemed to get along well and started to see each other on a regular basis. I didn't inquire, nor did I want to know the intimate details of their relationship. The bottom line was she appeared to be happy and Dennis seemed like he cared for her. For the moment, I thought that I didn't have that particular subject to worry about. Boss. One of the lower-level employees at Papaya excitedly ran up to the back table where Claude and Armin sat. Claude looked up, irritated by the interruption. "What the hell do you want?" Claude scowled at the young man. "The chick you were looking for, you know, the one, married to Jasmine's husband. The Chinese chick." He was now out of breath with excitement as he tried to explain to Claude. Claude studied the kid, finally understanding what he was trying to say. Yeah, I know," Claude said. "What about her?" "She was just at the coffee shop," he said, and hooked his thumb over his shoulder pointing toward the shop. "She took off with Dennis," he told Claude. "Dennis?" Claude questioned. "You sure?" The kid just nodded. Claude thought about this information. The kid was still hovering around the back table. "Okay, kid, you done good," Claude said as he pulled a couple of bills off his money roll and stuffed them in the kid's front shirt pocket. "Now beat it," Claude commanded the young kid. Claude sat and thought. What was Dennis doing with Owen's new wife? Could the kid have really seen that? He definitely had seen something, Claude thought. And then he thought about Dennis. Dennis had worked at Papaya for a long time, and it sounded like he was getting ready to graduate. Now Dennis mostly worked in the coffee shop up front. And the closer he got to graduating, the more he began to act like he was too good for the old Papaya crowd, Claude thought. "Hey Armin," Claude said to his partner, "find someone to keep an eye on Dennis Libby. Somebody reliable." Armin nodded silently. He'd take care of it. I noticed that Nephi and Dennis seemed to be spending more and more time together. It wasn't unusual for the four of us to eat meals together. By an unspoken rule, Dennis did not spend the night at our house, and Nephi had not yet spent the entire night with Dennis. But there were several times she got home quite late. Late that fall, things seemed to be going well. Rena and I were happy, and Nephi seemed happy too, which buoyed the spirits of the whole household. I had nearly forgotten about the unpleasantness with Claude and Jasmine. I was pretty sure we had seen the last of them. "Okay," Armin began, "here's what I got." Claude Francis sat silently in the booth waiting for the report. Over the past week, he thought more and more about Owen. The way he disrespected and dumped Jasmine. And then the business on the tennis court. I'm gonna get even with that man, Claude thought. Turns out that's not his Saxon's wife, but his wife's sister. Armin said. The sister and Libby are together, a couple? Claude pondered the information Armin had just provided. Maybe that was the opening they needed. Get to him through the sister, he thought. What else? Claude asked. Any other details about the sister of Libby? Not much, but one thing my guy saw, Armin answered. It looks like on some Tuesdays or Thursdays the sister meets Libby at the coffee shop when he's done at 6 o'clock. Armin told Claude. Interesting, Claude said, tapping his index finger against his lips and staring into space. Deep in thought, Claude began to put a plan together. Hey sis, Nephi called to Rena as she headed to class. I'm going to meet Dennis tonight and get something to eat with him. I'll be home later, Nephi said. Nephi had 2 afternoon classes and then was going to study in the library. She'd walk over to the coffee shop and meet Dennis there at closing time. They'd go somewhere after that. As she walked, Nephi thought about how happy she was with her life in America. She was going to college. She had a good relationship with Dennis. She got to live with her sister, and people here seemed so nice. You got the stuff? Claude asked Armin. Armin nodded. Armin was behind the bar, something he often did when they were short a bartender. He didn't look out of place. He looked down at the crushed white tablets in a small white bowl on the counter below the bar. Armin had used roofies before. He knew the correct dose. You wanted the girl out of it, but not completely unconscious. He had fine-tuned the correct quantity. After all, he'd had a lot of practice, he thought with a smile. Just then Claude's phone rang. He listened without saying a word and disconnected. Is she coming? Jasmine whispered. Jasmine was sitting at the bar, but she had been told to wait upstairs. They didn't want Dennis to get suspicious of anything. Yeah, Claude answered. Now get lost. He told his sister. She knew the plan and went up the back stairs to Claude's office. As Nephi got to the coffee shop, a large American man arrived at the door at the same time. After you, he politely held the door open for Nephi. Thank you, she smiled and replied. As they entered the coffee shop, she saw Dennis behind the counter preparing to close down the shop for the night. Dennis, the large American called out. Good to see you, he said with a friendly tone, and then began a short, pleasant conversation with Dennis. Come on, I'll buy you a drink, Nephi heard him say. I don't know, Dennis said and looked at Nephi. It's just a drink, no harm, he said persuasively. He then turned toward Nephi, that same smile on his face. Hi, I'm Claude Francis, and he reached out to shake Nephi's hand, his large hand engulfing hers. How about just one quick drink, and then you're on your way, Claude said, smiling at them both. Dennis looked at Nephi, and she nodded with some enthusiasm. The man seemed nice, she thought. They walked back to the large bar behind the coffee shop. Come on, the big man, Claude said good-naturedly. Let's all sit at the bar. Dennis knows the way, and playfully clapped Dennis across the back. Armin, Claude said to the bartender, how about that new IPA we just got on tap? You like beer, don't you? He turned to Nephi and asked her. Nephi nodded, and the man behind the bar poured them 3 large glasses of the foggy beer. Cheers. Claude motioned to the group, and they clinked glasses. The beer was strong, Nephi thought. Not bad, just stronger than she was used to. Good thing we thought to give them the bitter new IPA, Claude thought. The Rohypnol can have an aftertaste. The bitterness of the beer will certainly mask that. Armin was experienced with roofies. He knew all the tricks. Claude continued to toast the group and take large gulps, urging Nephi and Dennis to enjoy their beer. He first began to notice Nephi beginning to slur her words, just slightly at first. Then Claude noticed Dennis acting confused and alarmed. Several minutes later, Nephi began to slump on her stool. Claude knew he needed to get these two upstairs and out of sight before anyone noticed them. Claude said quietly to Nephi, Do you need to use the bathroom? She sat for a minute and then nodded yes. Armin, come on, Claude said. Let's take them upstairs to my bathroom. They'll have more privacy. Does that sound okay? Claude asked Nephi. She nodded her head, flopping heavily as her chin slumped against her chest. The 4 of them, with Claude and Armin assisting Dennis and Nephi, clambered up the back stairs that led to Claude's office. Claude's office was a converted apartment. There was the office area with a desk, file cabinets, and a bookcase, and then there were 2 fully functioning bedrooms with attached bathrooms. By this time, both Dennis and Nephi were completely out of it, walking and still slightly conscious, but the roofies had taken effect. Armin and Claude dumped them on the bed. Just then Jasmine appeared. Give me Dennis, she said. Then you boys can have your fun. Just take plenty of pictures. As Jasmine struggled to get Dennis into the other room, she looked back at Claude, Armin, and Owen's drugged-up sister-in-law. They had already got her top off, and they were in the process of removing her pants. I got home about 5:30 and Rena was already in the kitchen making dinner. Is Nephi joining us tonight? I called out to Rena. Not tonight. She and Dennis are eating dinner in town. Rena told me. Around 8:30, I was going over some papers and Rena was reading. I saw her glance outside as the headlights of a car lit up our windows, but the vehicle kept going. I saw Rena look at her wristwatch. I better check in with Nephi, Rena said almost to herself. She punched in the contact and waited. It went to voicemail. Hey sis, just checking in. Call me if you need me. I heard her say. An hour or so later, I started shutting down my laptop and getting ready for bed. No word from Nephi? I asked. No, Rena replied. I thought she would have called by now, she said. Who knows? I said. Maybe her phone died. Yeah, maybe, Rena answered with a slight tone of concern. I told Rena I was heading up, and she replied that she was going to wait a little longer. I was in a deep sleep when Rena woke me. Owen, Rena half whispered to me. It's almost midnight. I've called Nephi 3 times and I even tried Dennis. I haven't heard anything from either of them. I'm a little worried. She told me. I sat up, still half asleep. I asked when was the last time she had tried calling. As I came out of my slumber, I half expected them to walk in the door at any moment. But that didn't happen. Why don't we wait another hour or so? And if we haven't heard anything, I'll drive over to Dennis's. I said to Rena. We heard nothing and I found myself winding through the dark streets on the way to Dennis's apartment. Rena stayed at home in case they showed up. I went to his unit. Through the windows, I saw it was dark inside. Maybe they're asleep, I hoped. I knocked on the door continuously for perhaps 2 minutes. Nothing. I cruised the parking lot looking for his car. I didn't see it. I called Rena and gave her a quick report and told her I was going to drive through town and look for them. The town was quiet. It wasn't the weekend and the downtown bars all looked pretty empty. I checked to see if I could find Dennis's vehicle. Nothing on the street. There were a number of parking garages. They were a possibility, but I wasn't going to check all of them. Rena called and I could hear the alarm in her voice when she asked me if I'd had any success finding anything. I told her to stay at home and I would go back and wait at Dennis's apartment. By this time, it was after 2 a.m. I parked at the curb and waited. It was dark out and in the middle of the night, there was no activity outside. Before I knew it, I had dozed off. I awoke abruptly with my neck at an odd, painful angle. I checked my watch, 5:07 a.m. I quickly got out of the car, went to his apartment and knocked again. The place had an undisturbed look to it. I was pretty sure no one would answer. I texted Rena and told her I was going to head home, and then we would decide what to do next. I was worried on the drive back. Where could Nephi be? What is our next step? Was she with Dennis? These were the thoughts swirling around me on my way back. When I came over the rise and made the left onto our street, I saw an odd shape on the curb several houses down from our house. What was it? And then, getting closer, I saw it was a human. I quickly pulled over. I ran to the slumped figure and the shape became familiar. I recognized the long dark hair. Oh my God, it was Nephi. She was naked and fortunately, I could see she was breathing. She was dirty, stained looking, and her hair was a mess. It appeared as if she may have vomited on herself at some point. She was slumped on the curb, her bare legs laying in the roadway. Nephi. I shook her. She didn't move. Nephi. I said, Nephi, wake up. I shook her a little harder. I saw her eyes start to open and her lips started moving. I continued talking to her, trying to wake her. All of a sudden, she came alive. No, no, she screamed, flailing her arms. Stop, get away. She was now screaming loudly. Nephi, Nephi, sweetheart. I softly tried to talk to her. It's Owen. Gradually, she calmed down, focusing on me. She looked down at her own naked body and tried to cover up. I gave her my coat. She began to shiver. What? Where am I? She asked, looking around, and then she burst into tears. I quickly called Rena and explained the situation and then got Nephi into my car. Nephi was shaking nearly uncontrollably and I turned the car heat on full blast. Rena arrived quickly and we drove the short distance home. Nephi insisted on taking a shower. Rena tried to get her to talk and tell what had happened, but Nephi just kept repeating over and over, I don't know. Rena sat in the bathroom as Nephi took a long hot shower. She tried to talk to Nephi but could not get much information. I waited in the kitchen. Did she say anything? I asked. Not really, Rena replied. It looks like maybe she was on something or was drugged. When I ask her to try to remember, she gets upset and starts crying. I looked at Rena and saw the tears now streaming down her cheeks. I hugged her as the tears turned to sobs. She was grieving for her poor younger sister. All of a sudden, a thought hit me. Where's Dennis? I said out loud. Rena took a deep breath, wiped her cheeks, and told me it might be better if she and Nephi were alone. She suggested I leave for a bit and maybe try to find Dennis. I got back into the car and headed over to Dennis's apartment. It was the same as when I last saw it a few hours ago. It looked unoccupied. Sitting at the curb, I called Dennis. No answer. As I sat there, I got madder and madder. Something bad had happened to poor innocent Nephi. Something bad. And then my thoughts began to drift to who may have done something to her. There was not a long list of suspects. In fact, beyond Claude and Jasmine, I couldn't think of any others. And then I thought about Dennis. Could his dating her be some type of elaborate revenge plot orchestrated by Claude and Jasmine? Had Dennis been in on it the whole time? I got madder as I sat and thought about all this. I decided to try calling Dennis again, and this time he answered. Hello? I heard his raspy response. Dennis, it's Owen. I barked into the phone. Where the hell are you? There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he may have hung up on me. I'm not sure. He slowly replied. Who is this again? He asked, his voice full of confusion. It's Owen. I shouted into the phone. Owen, oh, he replied. And then with a little more urgency, he asked, Where's Nephi? She's home and she is not okay. I told him. Where are you? What happened last night? We need to have a serious discussion, Dennis. I said with more than a touch of anger in my voice. We figured out he was in one of the downtown parking garages. Dennis wasn't sure how he got there. He told me he was heading home, and I told him I'd meet him at his apartment. A few minutes later, I saw him drive up, and he looked bad. Almost like Nephi, but he was dressed. I had little sympathy for him. He had put Nephi in danger, and something bad had happened. I needed to find out what exactly occurred. Owen, he said, visibly upset. That's all I remember. I promise you. He pleaded. Dennis had told me what he remembered about the previous night. He and Nephi had planned on getting dinner in town. She was going to meet him at the coffee shop where he worked, in front of Papaya. And that's when Claude showed up, he told me. I was as mad as I had ever been. And then what? I barked at Dennis. He then told me he remembered he and Nephi going into Papaya with Claude to have a drink. The next thing I knew, you called and I was in my car in the parking garage. He told me, his head hanging. I sat there in his dark apartment processing what I had learned. Claude, still holding a grudge, had lured subservient Dennis and innocent and trusting Nephi into Papaya. He likely drugged them, and then, I didn't even want to think what may have happened to Nephi. My fury was focused on Dennis, and I told him how irresponsible he was. But really, it wasn't his fault. My displaced anger at Dennis was beginning to be focused on Claude and probably Jasmine. I told Dennis I would talk to him again, later. Can I see Nephi? He asked. No, I shouted at him as I left. I called Rena, and she told me Nephi was resting. I said I would be home soon. Rena said that Nephi told a similar story to what I had learned from Dennis. Rena said that based on her medical knowledge, it sounded like they had been given some type of date assault drug. The nausea, the lack of memory were all consistent with this type of drug. I barely wanted to ask the next question, but I had to. Did Nephi think anything sexual may have happened to her? I asked reluctantly. Rena stared at me, and I saw silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She just sat like that, her shoulders trembling with her sorrow. I went to her and held her as her grief poured out. My anger grew. Finally, Rena spoke. She has no memory of what happened, Rena said, but she has some mild trauma and bruising in areas consistent with sexual assault. I did examine her, and she... Once again, Rena broke down in tears. She wiped her eyes and composed herself. When she feels better, I need to take her to the hospital and check for disease and to get her the morning after pill. At that point, the police will likely become involved. She told me. I sat there with my anger mounting. I knew it was Claude. I didn't know who else was involved, but I would bet my left arm Claude was behind all this. In my upbringing, I was taught forgiveness and to turn the other cheek. In this situation, that was not possible. And Owen, there is one other thing I need to do later, she told me. I looked at her. What's that? I need to call Bhakti, she said with a serious look. Thinking about that phone call to Bhakti, I was fairly sure I could not have felt worse. I had brought the girls to America with the unspoken promise that I would protect them. And then this unthinkable assault had occurred to poor, innocent Nephi, on my watch. Later, Rena and Nephi went to the hospital and were there for most of the afternoon. I asked if I could be with them, and I was told kindly, but firmly, no. Dennis tried to call me a few times, but I was not prepared to talk to him. I knew none of this was his fault, yet I could not help but partially blame him. When they returned, Nephi once again went to her room to rest. It was sad watching her. This young girl, with all her trusting optimism, seemed lifeless now. Rena told me they checked for disease and would get the results in a few days. She took the morning after pill to prevent pregnancy. The police came and took Nephi's statement and said they would also talk to Dennis. Because she had showered, there was no genetic DNA for evidence. And also because of her impaired memory, there wasn't much information they could use in the investigation. They did say they would go to Papaya and interview the staff and customers, but they were not optimistic. It's hard to build a case without evidence, the detective had said to Rena. I had to take a walk after hearing that. I had never really known the burning desire for revenge like I was now feeling. This was contrary to the lessons of my upbringing. But this heinous act on such an innocent young woman overruled the hard-wired morality my family had preached to me. When I arrived back home, Rena was on the telephone. I heard her speaking in distinct Indonesian. She was talking quietly and seriously. I gathered that she was talking to Bhakti. The conversation went back and forth with periods of silence as Rena would listen and then reply in her native language. Later, she came into the kitchen where I sat quietly at the table. Bhakti and Vaikal are coming, she told me. When? Why? I asked. I felt so guilty and responsible for Nephi's assault. They will get here as soon as they get things arranged. Rena said. They are coming to be with Nephi. She needs to be surrounded by family. And then, they are taking Nephi home. That did it. My anger, guilt, and sadness boiled over. I grabbed my keys and took off. Owen, Rena called to me as I left. Where are you going? I didn't reply, but I had a definite destination. Papaya. Even through my fury, I tried to plan some kind of a strategy for the confrontation. Entering the large building, I still wasn't sure what I would do. I just knew I had to confront Claude. I wanted to look him in the eyes and see the guilt. I needed this to decide what the final plan would be. Even after all the years, the big open barroom seemed familiar. It even smelled the same as I recalled from those years ago. I stood in the entrance, my eyes adjusting to the lack of light. Then I saw him, sitting with that scum Armin back in the same booth they used to sit in. I walked briskly and directly up to the two of them. What did you do? What did you give her? I said to Claude, startling him for a moment. Well, if it isn't my ex-brother-in-law, how's your tennis game? He said to me with that same phony smile I'd seen 1,000 times before. Cut the crap, Claude. The police are involved. What did you do? I asked him. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. He calmly told me, that same fake expression on his face, trying to look innocent. We went back and forth for several minutes, me accusing and Claude acting as if he was unaware of what happened. Armin just sat quietly with a smirk on his face. I began to get angrier and angrier. My mind would flash from this big sloppy jerk to young vulnerable Nephi. After one particular rude comment, I grabbed an empty beer bottle, a makeshift weapon. The long neck in my fist, I pulled back, preparing for an attack. Just then Armin slid the newspaper that had been sitting in front of him to the side. Hidden beneath the paper was a matte black pistol. The barrel opening, more black and deadly looking than the rest of the gun. The unspoken threat was clear. I froze. Now, Owen, Claude spoke, feigning great patience. I think it's time for you to go home. It's probably for the best, for everyone. He replied once again with that same false concern. I stood there enraged and neutralized by Armin's gun. I stared at Claude with more hate than I had ever known. Finally, I turned to leave. Remember, Owen, he said to me as I was heading away. It's a jungle out there. I heard laughter erupt at my expense as I crossed the floor. Just as I was nearing the door, one last parting comment froze me for a moment. Tell Nephi, hello from us. He called across the barroom to me. She sure is a funny girl, he shouted. I heard more laughter at my expense as I exited the building. I pulled up to our house and had to sit for a few minutes to compose myself. My anger at Claude was boiling hot. I was also angry at the police, who seemed unwilling to pursue this crime. But most of all, I was angry at myself for not protecting Nephi. I felt like a failure. Finally, I came into the house and I was slightly encouraged to see Nephi up, looking normal, watching TV with Rena. Rena and I exchanged looks, but no words were spoken. I really didn't want to tell her I had seen Claude. That would just make her worry. Later, after Nephi had gone to bed, we talked. Bhakti and Vaikal will be here the day after tomorrow, she told me. I digested that with trepidation. Will they be angry with me for letting this happen? Will they want Rena to come home too? Would they think I wasn't able to take care of her? These were the thoughts swirling through my brain for the next few days. The good news was that Nephi seemed to be bouncing back. So far, we had kept Dennis away, but he continued to call. This was the first time in America for Bhakti and Vaikal, so for a day or two we showed them around and acted as if this was just a normal visit. The third night, Bhakti asked me to go on a walk with him. I knew this was coming, and with something approaching relief, Bhakti and I walked together that night. "Owen," he began softly, "why no American police put these men in jail?" he asked. I tried to explain about evidence, the judicial system, and how they were innocent until proven guilty. Even I didn't understand the logic of what I was trying to explain to Bhakti. I looked over at the small, dark older man. He walked silently down the path, hands clasped behind his back, head down, trying to absorb what I told, hitched across his face. "So police no help?" he asked. I shook my head no. He walked quietly a bit further. "Owen," Bhakti said, "these men must pay." I silently nodded yes. We continued to walk quietly through the darkness of the night. I could tell Bhakti was thinking. I began speaking once, and he held his hand up to silence me. He was deep in thought. Finally, as we turned to walk back to the house, Bhakti spoke. "You believe Dennis will help us?" he asked. I told him I did. "Have Dennis come see us tomorrow. I have plan. We need Dennis." "What's the plan?" I asked Bhakti. "You remember about Rebel that attacked Reena's mother and father?" He kept talking, not waiting for my answer. "How we defeat them was get them on our territory. We make them think there were more young village girls to puncto. They come back for girls. No girls, just men. We take care of problem. No happen again." Bhakti told me, as we approached the house. But before we entered, Bhakti turned toward me, clasped me on my shoulder, and said, "Mimbala's Dindam." He turned and walked in. I stood for a moment and thought, Mimbala's Dindam? Bhakti's word for revenge. The following day, Reena and Nephi drove to the city to shop. At the house, Bhakti, Vaikal, Dennis and I sat and planned. Bhakti talked and explained his strategy, the trap we would set for Claude and the others. In my opinion, it was a bit of a long shot. Bhakti was confident, but he did not know Claude, Jasmine, Armin, or whoever all else was involved. "Do not worry, Owen," he would try and reassure me. "I have planned." One thing that was working well was Dennis's involvement and enthusiasm to get payback. He really did feel awful about what had happened that night. His participation was critical to get the plan to work. "Nephi, Vaikal and I will leave in 3 days, Bhakti said. "We will wait for everything to work," he told us with great seriousness. Dennis walked into Papaya. He had worked there for so long it almost felt like home, but now a tainted home. His anger about what happened to Nephi was nearly as high as Owen's, but it was critical for him to play a role. He had to tamp down his emotions and act a particular way, a way that Bhakti had coached him to act. Slowly, Dennis approached the back booth where Claude sat. No Armin this time. Dennis tried to assume a natural-looking friendly smile on his face. He felt he was pulling it off. "Hey Claude," he addressed the big man. Claude was startled and looked wary at first, not sure what intentions Dennis may have. "Hey Denny," Claude replied, a bit of a smile on his face. "Where you been?" Claude asked. I been around, hanging out with Nephi. She is one hot Asian babe," Dennis said, trying to play the role he was coached to play. Claude, still wary, nodded in agreement. Claude and Dennis talked a few minutes about women, and Dennis brought the subject back to Nephi. "Not sure what exactly happened the other night," Dennis said, shaking his head and grinning, "but Nephi has been begging for it ever since." Dennis explained with an enthusiastic chuckle. "We could probably make something like that happen again." Claude offered a hopeful expression on his face. Dennis almost lost it. Somehow he kept the act up and kept his emotions under control. He explained to Claude that Nephi's old feeble uncle had come to take her home, and they were already back in Indonesia. "Too bad," Dennis told Claude. "She keeps texting me how she enjoyed the scene we had the other night and wants to do it again. Whatever happened, she seems to want more. You guys must have done something to her that she loved." Huh, Claude thought. He hadn't figured she was all that freaky. He was surprised that she even remembered much of that night. "You never know," thought Claude. "I guess she was more into me than I thought. I may have to figure out a way to tap that again." Dennis left shortly after, but Claude continued to think about the Asian chick. She was good-looking and had a great body. Claude began to imagine how crazy she'd get without the roofie. Furthermore, he thought, I'd be getting payback to that a-hole Owen. I've got to figure out a way to get her back here, or somehow meet up with her again. This time I'll get pictures, Claude chuckled. "How'd it go?" I asked Dennis. "In my opinion, we accomplished the mission," Dennis replied. I think he believed me and was interested in Nephi. He seemed to buy into the idea that she wants to see him again. His overblown ego fed into that. I considered what Dennis had said. I agreed with him about Claude Francis's ego. He thought he was some type of chick magnet. And to be honest, he did seem to attract some good-looking women, but they were all a little trashy. Not like Nephi. Okay, I said, let's move into phase 2, the text messages. We will start sending them tomorrow. You try to get close with Claude and gauge his reactions. Remember, Dennis, your role is critical. I told him. Will do. He answered, hey, it's Nephi, how you doing? My uncle brought me home. They thought I was getting into trouble in America. Claude couldn't believe he got a text from Owen's wife's sister. She really was into him. He would play it cool and see what happened. Hi, sweetheart. Too bad you're clear across the world. We could have some fun together. Several minutes later, Claude got another text. I know. I'm mad at my uncle. He thinks I'm a child. I can do grown-up things. In fact, last night I thought about doing some grown-up things with you. Oh wow, Claude thought. She is hot for me. What kind of grown-up things, sweetheart? And then the flirtatious text messages continued. Rena and Michael were actually composing the messages, first running them by Dennis and Owen to make sure they were having the right effect for their game plan. The next step was the pictures. They got a few of Nephi, facial only, but the other photos were of Rena. Then they would selectively parcel them out to Claude with text messages containing sexual references of what he could do to each body part, all pretending they were of Nephi. The reports from Dennis indicated they were having the correct effect on Claude. The text with pictures continued for a few days. Claude was excited by the pictures, but his longing for the young Asian girl was unfulfilled. The more messages he got from Nephi, the more he needed her sexually in the debased way he had taken her before. The thought of her with multiple partners, including him, had Claude in a lust-filled fever. And then phase 3 of the plan. Dial up the pressure. Hey Claude, good news. My old uncle has to go and help one of his cousins on their farm next month. I'll be all alone for 3 weeks. Please come visit me. When Claude saw that message, he dismissed it at first. And then he began to think about it. He recalled a few years ago he and Armin flying to Bangkok and hitting the Thai massage parlors. They had spent a week in Bangkok and it had been fun. But those were prostitutes. This would be something completely different. Sweetheart, that sounds interesting. Mind if I bring a couple of people with me? Claude still wasn't sure if he would actually go, but it was worth exploring, he thought. It was several days before she replied. Of course, the more the merrier. I think that's what they say. Yes, please come. Bring friends. I will send you pictures of my friends who will party with us. Later that night, Claude received a picture of 4 attractive Asian women smiling and waving, all in somewhat revealing clothes. These weren't Nephi's friends, they were actually prostitutes from Jakarta. Michael had selected the most wholesome-looking girls he could find. They had paid them for the pictures. Armin, Claude said, take a look at this. And he showed Armin the pictures he had received. Claude and Armin discussed the trip, both of them starting to buy into the idea of another sex junket to Asia. This time, though, it wouldn't be with prostitutes, it would be with kinky, attractive amateurs. What are you guys talking about? Jasmine asked as she walked up. Reluctantly, Claude told her. I get to go. Jasmine demanded. After all, it's my husband we're getting back at. And, she added, as she looked at the text, a couple of those Chinese girls look pretty hot. Claude gave her a long, questioning look. Are you? He began. Just curious, she said. Sometimes I get tired of men. She explained. Claude just shook his head, looked at Armin, who shrugged, palms up. Here, Jasmine said. Give me the dates and the airports and I'll look into the flights. This plan is actually coming together, I thought. According to Dennis, and based on the text back from Nephi, it was actually Michael that was fielding the messages from Claude. They were going to be in Bima on the 18th of next month. We needed to get there by the 16th. Rena spent several hours making flight arrangements for her and I. The good news was the plan was working. The bad news was Nephi. She was suffering from post-traumatic stress from the attack. She also wanted the life she was starting in America, but she was frightened by the terrible experience. These combinations of emotions put her into a depression. We needed to get revenge for the brutal attack. Membelas Dindam. All too soon, Rena and I were back in Bima. As we deplaned, the sounds, the sights, and the smells were distinctly familiar, and it reminded me of a simpler time when I first arrived in Indonesia. But I did not have time for maudlin reminiscences. We had a plan to execute. Yes, execute was a good word for it. The familiarity of the Fawzi home where Michael, Nephi, and Bhakta lived was comforting. We had a nice meal together, and then Nephi prepared to stay at the Effendis. EKA, the older Effendi brother, drove over in their flatbed farm truck to pick up Nephi. I walked Nephi to the truck. I gave young Nephi a hug goodbye. I'm so sorry, I told her. Owen, I just don't want to be afraid anymore. She told me with tears streaming down her cheeks. I was nearly in tears myself, but once again that emotion turned from sorrow to anger. I take care of her, EK pledged. The text messages continued back and forth with Michael and Rena editing them to make sure Claude did not back out. The morning of the day they were to arrive was busy. We were going to make the Fozzie house a trap. Rena, pretending she was Nephi, would be the bait. That part of the entire plan made me most nervous. Bhakti noticed my anxiety. Owen, he said to me. His forehead dipped down to touch mine as I sat. Plan will all work out. No one from our family be hurt. He told me. Trust plan. Part of that plan was that Nephi or Rena would be naked when they arrived. This was to make sure their focus was distracted as they approached the house. From a distance, she would be indistinguishable from Nephi. Rena was modest around Michael and Bhakti, but the time for embarrassment had long passed. Now, all the preparations had been completed. We waited. Bhakti and I were crouched in an outbuilding about 20 yards from the house. Michael was in the house in a small room off the kitchen. Michael would signal us when the text of their arrival was received. It was mid-afternoon. Their flight from Bima had landed at 1:20 p.m. We knew it would take time to deplane, get luggage, and the rental car. Bhakti and I waited in the shed. I was nervous, but Bhakti seemed unflappably calm. There were moments I questioned the entire operation, but when I thought of Nephi and the brutal attack, my resolve hardened. It must have been after 3 o'clock when we received the message from Michael that they were on the way. My nerves really ramped up now. Shortly, we saw the telltale dust of an approaching vehicle. That was the signal for Rena to come out on the shaded porch. Naked, through a gap in the shed, Bhakti and I saw the metallic silver Honda Brio pull up in front of the Fozzie house. Rena, posing as Nephi, smiled, breasts slightly bouncing as she waved, and entered the house. Hi, she called as she went through the door, her round, beautiful ass in view. Come on in, she called to the group. I'm in the back. Through the cracks we saw Claude. Then Armin emerged from the Brio, but then to my surprise Jasmine got out. For a moment again I wondered if we were doing the right thing. Then I thought of poor Nephi and what she had been subjected to. My doubts were erased. Be ready, Bhakti said to me, clasping my forearm. Seeing the naked woman, Claude and Armin nearly sprinted to the house with Jasmine a bit more tentative. We emerged from the shed, and just as Jasmine was entering the house, she must have heard us. She stopped stunned at seeing me. Claude, she cried. It's a trap. We ran to the house hearing the commotion. Michael was struggling for the moment with the wiry Armin. Jasmine turned toward me, anger etched across her face. Her fingernails bared and came at me. Though I could have easily overpowered her, my deep-set lessons about not hitting a girl prevented a quick disablement. Meanwhile, I saw Claude bolt out the front door. Between him and the rental car was Bhakti. I was still struggling with Jasmine, but my attention was outside as Claude approached Bhakti. Claude was much bigger and stronger, and certainly younger than Bhakti, who had to be in his 60s. But what Claude, and quite frankly I didn't know, was that Bhakti had been a master in several martial arts. Claude rushed straight at the older man. Bhakti grabbed his wrist, twisted and pivoted, and soon had Claude on the ground incapacitated, just on the verge of snapping the big man's elbow with a pressure hold. Claude was yelling and swearing and threatening Bhakti and anyone else, telling us all we'd be sorry. Michael emerged and quickly, with heavy-duty duct tape, secured the snarling Jasmine. I looked in and Armin had already been taped. Roughly, Michael shoved Jasmine to the ground and approached Claude, who was still being forced to the ground by Bhakti's hold on his wrist. Michael had been told about the attack on Nephi. Bhakti was particularly fond and protective of his younger cousin. He knew that whoever else had been involved, Claude was the ringleader. I watched as Michael unhurriedly walked up to Claude and unleashed a savage sidekick to Claude's jaw, knocking him out. We had the three of them secured and in the house. We needed to wait until it got a little darker for the next part of the journey. Bhakti motioned for Michael to cut the gags off the faces of our captives. Immediately, Jasmine started screaming for help. Put gag back on her, Bhakti said. Jasmine sputtered and struggled as Michael aggressively regagged her. Bhakti sat on a small stool in front of the prisoners, bent forward, hands on his knees. He stared at them with his normal, friendly expression on his face, but beneath that expression there was a harsher edge than he normally showed. Why you hurt Nephi? He asked neutrally, searching Claude and Armin's face for answers. We didn't do nothing, let us go. We're American citizens, we have rights. You need to release us, Claude blustered. You will be released, Bhakti told them, but first tell me why you hurt my niece. She didn't object, Claude finally admitted. She liked it. Claude said with a near smile on his face. Vaikal, angry at the comments, quickly got up, but Bhakti held his arm to restrain him. You give her drug, then use her. Bhakti continued. Why? The conversation went back and forth like that for several minutes, them denying any wrongdoing and Bhakti calmly asking for a confession. All the time Claude demanded to be let free, and Bhakti assured them they would be freed. Just not quite yet. It was getting close to the time to go and Bhakti had one last question. You think it okay to attack young girl, take her clothes, and throw her out, like garbage in Strangeland? He asked. After a minute Claude replied, almost smiling as he answered. Pops listened, he began addressing Bhakti. She had a good time. So what if we forgot her clothes? She got home, didn't she? Claude replied. Bhakti stared at Claude. I'd never quite seen his kind face take on this particular transformation. Put gag on them, Bhakti said as he turned away from the three. We go now. We piled the three of them in the back of a large van-like commercial vehicle. Claude, Armin, and Jasmine were secured and gagged with the duct tape. They were also secured with rope to a stanchion in the back of the vehicle. Bhakti drove and Rina followed in the rental car. Vaikal and I kept watch over the captives. The vehicle rumbled over the rough road across the island of Simbawa. The roads were rough, unsaved, but there was almost no traffic at this hour. Eventually we arrived at the small harbor. We waited in the vehicle. Bhakti got out and walked down to the docks. He was gone for about 45 minutes. After returning, he looked into the vehicle and motioned for us to bring the captives. Several kilometers earlier, Rina had turned left toward the ferry dock and parked the rental car at the large crowded automobile park adjacent to the terminal. She was dressed in black, and at this time of night she was nearly invisible. 15 minutes later, EKA Effendi picked her up outside the terminal and brought her back to the Effendi's house where she was reunited with Nephi. The dilapidated boat chugged out of the harbor with the running lights on. Our captives were still bound and gagged below deck in the hold. I felt nauseous. A combination of the chop of the waves, the stress of the day, and the mixed odor of diesel exhaust and fish. Bhakti's cousin piloted the boat, and I never saw him speak a word the entire time we were on the water. Not once did he look at our captives, or me for that matter. The only interaction I saw was Bhakti speaking softly to him and a brief nod, just once, from the cousin. Just before we docked, Bhakti had us remove the gags and give the captors each a bottle of water. That also gave Jasmine an opportunity to speak. Owen, please, she begged. Let me go. I didn't do anything. It was those two. She nodded her head toward Claude and Armin. Shut up, bitch, Claude bellowed. You're both going to get gagged again if you keep talking. I told them. Owen, Jasmine whispered. Please, please, please let me go. If I ever meant anything to you, I beg of you. She pleaded. I did look at her. I tried to summon up some memory of a happier time with Jasmine, but every time a flash of our happier early life crept into my brain, the sight of poor young Nephi, naked and dumped on the side of the road, eclipsed any happy memories. You will all be freed soon, I said. It won't be long. I turned and climbed the ladder to the deck. I was getting tired of the sight of the three of them. We waited in the dark on the primitive dock. Vaikal walked up the hill, and several minutes later, we heard the sputtering noise of a large vehicle at the top of the steps from the dock. Bhakti, Vaikal, and I unbound our captives' legs, allowing them to walk. They seemed eager to get out of the stuffy, malodorous boat, but their pace appeared more tentative as they were marched up the steps toward the rumbling vehicle. We had to muscle the three of them into the back of the open bed of the truck. They were tied to the uprights in the back. Their legs were rebound with duct tape, and a large piece of brown burlap was placed over the three and then secured to the truck. I took a few paces backward and examined the truck with our passengers. It looked like cargo. It was unlikely we would see anyone else going where we were going, but just in case we needed the camouflage, I climbed into the back of the flatbed too. Vaikal drove, and Bhakti navigated. We took off slowly on the rough pathway. I knew from speaking with Bhakti, the heavily rutted road will only get worse the further we traveled. Our movement was slow. As I watched the progress of the chugging vehicle, it was often unclear where the primitive roadway was. A few times we stopped the vehicle in Vaikal, and I would need to move small down trees or several other obstructions out of the way. Be careful, Vaikal said to me. Check for snakes. I looked at him, and he was dead serious. But he was also correct to warn me. I knew throughout Indonesia there were poisonous snakes, and as I glanced around at our current surroundings, there was no doubt we were in the jungle, and it appeared we would be traveling further into the vegetation. After another bumpy hour or so of travel, the vehicle stopped. For a moment, we just sat in the jungle. Sunlight began to seep through the canopy of trees above. I looked around at our surroundings. We were in a clearing in the midst of a tropical rainforest. Vaikal and Bhakti emerged from the cab. Bhakti took a worn tarp and spread it out on a flat part of the clearing. One by one, we brought the three of them, gagged and blindfolded out, and sat them on the tarp. Vaikal then took out his long sharp kris, a local type of knife. While Claude, Armin, and Jasmine were still bound, Vaikal, with a surgeon's precision, cut away their clothes. He then, with no concern for their pain, ripped their duct tape blindfolds and gags off. I took a second and gazed at Jasmine, naked. For a moment, the old memories of our early time and my sexual awakening with Jasmine was triggered by her nude beauty. I felt myself, for a minute, begin to feel uncertain of my resolve on this mission. But quickly the memory of poor Nephi overshadowed any sympathy towards Jasmine once again. We had to do this for Nephi and other vulnerable young women that these people had preyed upon. It took a minute for the three of them to adjust to the unblindfolded brightness, and I saw them take deep breath through their mouths. Their hands and feet still tightly bound by the duct tape. Gradually they examined their surroundings, seeing the tall trees and dense vegetation, the unfamiliar jungle noises unseen but constant in the dense jungle. They were also now naked, but embarrassment was the least of their worries. They all, including Claude, looked frightened. Bhakti crouched a few feet in front of them, his normal pleasant smile on his face, a long piece of grass in his mouth, staring at the three. "What are you going to do with us?" Claude bellowed, and then threatened us all. Armin and Jasmine demanded the same answers. What were we going to do with them? Where were they? And when are we going back? Bhakti continued staring good-naturedly, his head now nodding up and down. Finally, the three of them grew tired of their own questions and Bhakti's silence. "Okay," Bhakti said, "answer your question now. You ask what we doing with you. We let you go, just like you ask. Where are we? You ask." And he looked up at the sky and all around. "We on Dragon Island," Bhakti said with a wider smile. Claude, Armin, and Jasmine listened to Bhakti but looked confused. I could see one by one they began to understand their fate. Then the negotiating started. "I can get you 100K within 24 hours, Claude offered. When no one replied. 200 then. He was now begging. "Please, please, please," Jasmine was pleading and sobbing. And then from Armin, it was his idea, and he nodded toward Claude. "I didn't want to have any part of the whole thing," he begged. This triggered an internal argument between Claude and Armin. Jasmine continued to weep. This went on for some time with no effect on any of us. Finally, Vaikal threw them each a bottle of water, and we prepared to get back in the vehicle and leave. "Why?" Claude asked. "Why do it like this?" And he nodded around to his surroundings. Bhakti faced Claude now, standing up. No hint of mirth on his face, he addressed Claude. "You abuse my niece," he said to Claude, "and then leave her without clothes in strange foreign land. That what you do to her?" And any hint of Bhakti's calm, pleasant expression was gone. "That what we do to you," he said. "But why?" Claude was becoming frantic. Bhakti had turned toward our vehicle. At Claude's question, he stopped. "You read Bible?" he asked Claude. There was no reply. In Leviticus it say, "Eye for eye, tooth for tooth." Bhakti said, "Here is knife, help you untie." And he threw an ancient rusty knife on the tarp. It would take them some time to saw through all the duct tape. And with that we all began getting into the vehicle. Wait, shouted Claude. "What is Dragon Island? Where are we?" "You're on Komodo Island," Vaikal told them, "home to the Komodo dragon. The Komodo dragon is the largest lizard on Earth. Be careful, their bite is venomous, they have sharp teeth, and are not afraid of humans," Vaikal added. Finally, as we were getting in the vehicle, Claude yelled, "Please, Owen, please." "Claude," I called back, and he looked at me with a hopeful expression. "Remember, it's a jungle out there." And with that, we were gone. 3 days later, Rena and I were back home. It seemed so odd that we had only been gone a week. So much had occurred. We didn't speak much about it. We were just intent on reclaiming the lives that we had before all this had happened. Often, when I was alone, out on a run or a walk, I would think about what we had done, how the retribution was diametrically opposite of what I was taught growing up morally. But, try as I might, I could not summon up any guilt. What we had done had to be done. I was not going to have Nephi live the rest of her life in fear because of Claude and his crowd. Not on my watch, I thought. After much discussion, Nephi had decided to return to America and stay with us. We had assured her that any threats from the people that assaulted her were gone. We gave her no details, just assurance. She had said she liked America and wanted to come back. On the evening before Nephi's flight landed, I was out for an evening walk as Rena prepared Nephi's room. I allowed my mind to think deeply about the entire plan. Finally, I began to wonder about what had happened to those three. Did they survive? Was that possible? We had heard nothing from anyone regarding Claude, Jasmine, and Armin, and we had not inquired. Still, I just couldn't help but wonder what happened. Jasmine and Claude moved slowly through the jungle. I am so tired, she thought. At first, they had tried to follow the rutted path that the truck had traveled on. Quickly, they became lost in the dense jungle. They had no idea where they were or where they were going. And I'm getting eaten alive by all the bugs, Jasmine observed. Their progress was slow and Jasmine was constantly worried about more snakes. The first night, Jasmine, Claude, and Armin had tried to keep moving in the darkness. They were looking for any type of civilization. So far, all they'd seen was jungle. It was near total darkness with just faint illumination from the moon. They tried to move as swiftly as possible. Armin was leading the trio. All of a sudden, Jasmine heard Armin let out a high-pitched scream and tried to back up, slumping to the ground. In the moonlight, Jasmine saw the dark-colored banded snake slither away into the underbrush. What Jasmine or the others didn't understand was that this was a banded kite. Its venom can be up to 10 times more poisonous than a king cobra. Armin immediately began to feel the effects of the snake bite. Jasmine watched in horror. For a minute or so, Claude and Jasmine contemplated staying with their poisoned companion. But quickly, Jasmine realized not only was there nothing they could do, but they were all in survival mode, every man for themselves. Without looking back, Jasmine and her brother moved down the trail. Armin was left to die in agony, alone in the jungle. Fatigue was affecting Claude too, Jasmine saw. He was stumbling and walking unsteadily. We need to rest, Jasmine thought. It's nearly nightfall again. Claude, let's take a break, Jasmine told Claude. The big man stopped but said nothing. Unsteadily, he spread out the burlap tarp on the jungle floor. Claude slumped into a fetal position, exhausted. I better check for snakes, Jasmine thought. She scanned the closest vegetation and saw nothing. I know they're out there, she thought. The rustling in the undergrowth told them there were many other animals inhabiting the jungle. With trepidation, Jasmine slumped down on the tarp, resting against Claude's broad back. Ah! Suddenly, Claude screamed and Jasmine was jolted out of a deep fatigue-fueled sleep. Claude's yell and quick movement startled her. She saw Claude kicking at something. A snake? No, it was much bigger. At first, she thought it was a crocodile, but it was something else. The creature moved away on 4 legs with its odd alternating short-legged movement. Shit, what was that thing? Claude shouted, looking at his foot. Hell, that hurts. Jasmine looked down and saw Claude's foot red with blood. The animal must have bitten Claude, she surmised. Claude, we gotta get out of here, Jasmine said in a near-hysterical tone. The snakes were bad enough, and now this other monster. What had the guy called it? Some kind of dragon? Come on, Claude, Jasmine said as she picked up the burlap. They continued on in the same aimless manner. This time, Jasmine was leading the way. The going was slower than ever. The thought of snakes and now dragons made each step potentially dangerous. At one point, Jasmine glanced over her shoulder and saw that Claude was not even keeping up with her slow pace. Claude, keep moving, she shouted back at her brother. Claude just nodded. By what must be midday, the heat and humidity were too much. Jasmine found a small creek in the dense jungle. The water offered slight relief from the thick, hot air. Claude was still lagging, and when he finally arrived at the edge of the creek, Jasmine saw why. They washed away the blood and saw the puncture marks from the dragon's bite. Claude's foot had swollen with purple and red signs of infection all along his left foot. They rested for a while, both dozing off. Jasmine jolted awake, haunted by the living nightmare of their situation. Claude, let's go, she said. We gotta move. She added as she stood up. Claude looked up at his sister, eyes glassy, shook his head and then nodded at his infected foot. I ain't going nowhere on this foot, he told Jasmine. She looked at the foot and the swelling had increased. Claude's foot looked like a football, swollen and distended. I'll stay here, Claude painfully told his sister. You go get help. She looked at him, and he looked back. They both knew this was the end for him. There were no emotional farewells. Jasmine just turned and headed back into the jungle. Life for me was nearly normal. I had 4 classes this term and I was writing a paper on alternative farming methods to increase yield. Rena continued to work at the campus clinic, and she seemed energized providing medical help to the young people at Taft University. Our relationship grew stronger. Vikel brought Nephi back, and to my surprise, Vikel stayed with us. I moved my office to a small outdoor building. This allowed the 3rd bedroom for Vikel. I was glad he was here. I just was unsure of his plans. And suddenly our house seemed to get a bit crowded. Nephi had bounced back. There were moments when the effects of her trauma were visible. We'd be in town and suddenly she would cling to Rena or burst into tears. We would assure her she was safe and the bad people were gone. Speaking of the bad people, I had heard not a word about Claude, Jasmine, or Armin. I did talk to someone that told me that Papaya was closed. I had a lot more questions, but I knew I could show no extra interest toward any of that. Every so often I would wonder briefly about Jasmine. Jasmine was so tired. Her feet hurt badly from the jungle. She had so many insect bites there was barely any skin left that wasn't bitten. But most of all, it was the fatigue. I really need to rest, she thought. There was what looked like a dry stream bed that offered flat ground for Jasmine to lay out the tarp. Her fatigue was so great she didn't even check for snakes this time. She just placed the tarp on the most hospitable-looking area. She noticed an odd smell. Fecund, earthy, and something else. Something like old meat left too long in the refrigerator. She took a quick glance around, saw nothing and laid down on the tarp. Maybe tomorrow I'll find some people to help me, she thought as she fell asleep. What? Jasmine jolted awake. In the early morning light, she sensed movement and then the smell. It was horrible. She sat up and suddenly her eyes adjusted. The shape was moving toward her quickly. Jasmine jumped up and moved to get away from the horrible dragon creature. Jasmine, in her weakened state, wasn't near quick enough. The Komodo can run up to 20 kilometers per hour for short distances. Jasmine had no chance. Jasmine screamed as the dragon's first bite sunk into her calf. Months later, what a strange experience, I thought as I sat in the chair. If my mom and dad saw me now, they wouldn't believe it. In fact, I could not believe it either. Rena had made the appointment and talked me into it. But a manicure? I remember years ago when looking at my hands, working with soil and fertilizers. I recall wondering if the ground and stains on my fingers and hands were permanent. I remember the ever-present slivers of dirt beneath my fingernails. And now someone is buffing those same fingernails. But for me, there have been a lot more changes than that which was happening to my fingers. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It all started nearly 3 months after our trip to Komodo Island. Out of the blue, I received a call from the attorney that helped me with my divorce, John Scalia. He asked that I meet him at his office. John, what's this all about? I asked. I truly just wanted that entire chapter of my life over. For many obvious reasons. Owen, it's best if we meet in person, he said. It's complicated. We set a time to meet at his office. I was curious but worried too. What could he want with me that was complicated? With the same serious manner I recalled from our earlier involvement, he shook my hand. This has to do with your ex-wife Jasmine Duval, he told me. Oh, great. Just when I had begun to completely erase her, she's back. John, we've been divorced for years. I said, what about her could possibly involve me? I asked. Like I said, it's complicated. He said, and then he told me about the complications. 60 days ago, the Indonesian Forest Service found the bodies of 3 people on the island of Komodo. Genetically, they traced 2 of the identities back to Claude Francis Duval and Jasmine Duval. This island is inhabited by the largest lizard on Earth, the Komodo dragon. It is also home to Komodo National Park. There are tours to the island under heavy supervision. Every year, people try to break away from the group and attempt to find the lizards on their own. This is illegal, and most people are discovered fairly quickly. Somehow the Duvals got deep into the jungle. They were attacked, killed, and partially eaten, most likely by the Komodo dragon the Forest Service believes. Their remains were retrieved. DNA was tested, and fortunately, they were able to match the DNA to the Duvals to a 99.8% certainty. At this point, he paused. With a mixture of emotions, I absorbed this news. Later, I reflected that Scalia may have thought my silence was sorrow from hearing about my ex-wife's death. It wasn't. Finally, I replied, but, John, what does this have to do with me, and why are you involved? I asked. Okay, he began. Let me get to that. And then he told me. He had been contacted by an attorney in St. Louis. Apparently, Claude Francis inherited the building that Papaya occupied from his mother, whose 3rd husband had left it for her. Their mother passed away 3 years ago. Jasmine was named as the heir to 100% of Claude Francis' estate. And Jasmine never changed the will you, and she set up when you were first married. He explained. I sat in Scalia's office trying to absorb this information. So are you saying? I began, still somewhat unclear on what this all means. What I'm saying is you are the sole heir to real estate with an approximate value of $2.8 million. There are no living relatives to challenge the will. This includes a restaurant, retail space, and he listed off the specific pieces of property, some of which I knew quite well. Papaya was now called Typhoon. Its menu was described as Pan-Asian fusion. Vikal was the executive chef. Nephi and her significant other ran the coffee shop, and with a new menu and decor business was booming. And no, her significant other was not Dennis Libby. Dennis tried to rekindle something with Nephi, but unfortunately he was too closely associated with the horrible night at Papaya. To this day, he has remained a friend and has never spoken a word about the plan for revenge. Nephi was now with EKA Effendi. They had grown up together, and during the entire time Nephi was back home he took care of her. That was what she needed, and EKA was happy to provide that to a girl he'd had a crush on since the 4th grade. They were engaged and would be married soon. Bhakti had moved to America too. He left his farm to his cousin. The cousin had grown tired of fishing and had decided he wanted a life on land. Bhakti was the perfect maitre d' for Typhoon. With his pleasant disposition and exotic look and speech, he was popular with the customers. There were moments when I questioned if what we had done was right. I still wonder about that, but I never felt guilt. I was happy that my family was happy, and as I left the manicurist, I was happy my hands were clean. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.